She was just the girl who cleared the plates, elegant, anxious, a shadow in a black dress. To the elite clientele of the coastal bistro, she was nobody. But when the legendary Don Denaro, an elderly titan in a white suit, his skin a map of ink and scars, walked in, the very air in the room seemed to vanish. Beside him sat his son, Greco, a sharp-eyed predator in a gray suit, waiting for the world to bleed. The tension was a physical weight until the Don's phone rang, a call that left the most feared man in Sicily visibly shaken. In his fury, he dropped a cryptic ancient proverb about a lost key in a dialect that hadn't been whispered in decades. The room went silent, but the waitress didn't flinch. She leaned in, hand over her heart, and finished the phrase with the chilling precision of a royal signature. It wasn't just a greeting, it was the return of a ghost. This is the story of Rosa, the woman hiding a fallen empire beneath a waitress's apron. Rosa moved through the dining room of L'Oltremare like a breeze, felt but never truly seen. In the 3 years she had worked at this high-end coastal bistro, she had mastered the art of being a ghost. She knew exactly how to angle her body so that the wealthy patrons saw only a tray of branzino or a refill of sparkling water, never the woman holding them. Her uniform, a plain black dress that was a fraction too large, swallowed her frame, and she kept her hair in a tight, severe bun that pulled at her scalp. It was a disguise of mediocrity, a shield built of napkins and polished silver. The lunch rush was a low-frequency hum of clinking cutlery and the rhythmic crashing of the Atlantic against the terrace pylons. Rosa liked the sound of the ocean. It was loud enough to drown out the echoes in her mind. As she polished a crystal wine glass, her thumb brushed against the faint, jagged line of a scar hidden beneath her watch strap, a permanent souvenir of a night when the world had smelled of smoke and spent shell casings. She quickly pulled her sleeve down, her heart fluttering like a trapped bird. To her co-workers, Rosa was simply the shy one. They joked that she was afraid of her own shadow, but they didn't realize she was actually protecting it. She never stayed for drinks after her shift. She never shared stories about a childhood in Sicily or a father whose name once made the cobblestones of Palermo tremble. She lived in a small, sterile apartment where nothing was bolted down and a packed bag always sat at the back of her closet. To be nobody was to be safe. If she could just remain a background character in other people's lives for long enough, perhaps the ghosts of the Moretti Syndicate would finally stop looking for her. She picked up a heavy water pitcher, her hands steady despite the cold dread that was her constant companion. She moved toward table 6, weaving through the scent of expensive cologne and sea salt. She practiced her waitress face in the reflection of a window, eyes downcast, lips pressed into a neutral, compliant line. It was a mask she wore so often it had started to feel like her real skin. But as she reached the edge of the dining area, the atmosphere changed. The rhythmic hum of the room didn't just dip, it died. The air grew heavy, charged with the kind of static that precedes a lightning strike. Rosa didn't need to look up to know that the predator had entered the room. She felt it in the marrow of her bones, the unmistakable arrival of old, heavy power. She stepped back into the shadows of the service station, her breath hitching. Her art of being nobody was about to face its greatest test. She watched from the periphery as the front door swung open, admitting a man who looked like an ivory statue of war. Don Denaro moved with a terrifying grace, his white suit glowing against the dim, moody lighting of the bistro. Beside him, Greco walked with the predatory stillness of a man who was always calculating the distance to his next victim's throat. Rosa gripped the handle of the pitcher until her knuckles turned white. Her pulse thundered in her ears, a frantic drumbeat of run, run, run. But she couldn't move. She was a shadow pinned to the wall by the blinding light of her past. She stood there, a nobody in a black dress, watching the men who had spent a decade trying to erase her bloodline from the earth walk toward the center of her carefully constructed world. She was the last Moretti, a girl hiding a kingdom beneath a stained apron, and for the first time in 3 years, the invisibility she had worked so hard to perfect felt as thin as glass. The heavy oak doors of Lo Tremare swung open, and the sea breeze that followed them in felt suddenly like a cold front preceding a storm. Don Denaro did not merely walk into a room, he claimed it. His white suit was blinding, a sharp ivory contrast to the muted ambers and deep blues of the bistro. At 70, he carried himself with the terrifying straightness of a man who had outlived every one of his enemies. On his weathered neck, a glimpse of a black ink tattoo, the jagged crown of the old world syndicates, peeked out from his silk collar, a reminder that the refined gentleman was merely a layer of paint over a warlord. Beside him, Greco moved like a shadow cast by a dying sun. He was the modern evolution of the Denaro bloodline, sharp, gray-suited, and wearing a face of absolute, calculating calm. While his father radiated a heat that made the other diners lower their eyes in instinctual submission, Greco was cold. His eyes scanned the room with the efficiency of a thermal scope, lingering on exits, bodyguards, and finally, the staff. He adjusted a cufflink, his own tattoos snaking down his wrists and disappearing into his palms, marking him as a man who was comfortable with the dirt of the trade. Rosa stood paralyzed behind the service station, the water pitcher in her hand suddenly weighed 100 pounds. She watched through the gaps in the decorative trellis as the maitre d', a man who usually carried himself with unbearable self-importance, stumbled over his words. The entire restaurant had become a vacuum. Conversations died mid-sentence, the clink of silverware vanished. Even the ocean outside seemed to quiet its roar, as if the water itself recognized the man who controlled the docks. The Don took his seat at the center table, the king's chair, with his back to the wall. He didn't look at the menu, he didn't look at the view. He simply placed a heavy, gold-encased cell phone on the white linen cloth and waited. Greco sat opposite him, leaning back with a stillness that was more threatening than any movement. He leaned in, whispering something to his father that made the old man's jaw tighten. Rosa felt the vibration of their presence in the floorboards. To the world, they were the Denaros, the rulers of the coast. To her, they were the monsters from the bedtime stories her father used to tell her to keep her away from the windows at night. She realized then that her anxious camouflage, the shy waitress persona she had lived in for years, was starting to crack. The air felt too thin. She needed to stay in the shadows, to let another waitress take the table, but the floor manager was already signaling her. The Don had requested a quiet server, and in the hierarchy of Lo Tremare, Rosa was the quietest. As she forced her legs to move toward the white-suited Titan and his tattooed son, she felt the scar on her wrist burn against her skin. She wasn't just walking toward a table. She was walking back into the fire she had spent a lifetime trying to extinguish. Greco's eyes flicked toward her as she approached, sharp and predatory, and for a terrifying heartbeat, Rosa wondered if a ghost could be recognized by a wolf. The silver tray in Rosa's hands felt like a lead weight as she crossed the threshold of the invisible line separating the service station from the Don's territory. Every step was a battle against the instinct to turn and bolt toward the kitchen's back exit. As she neared the table, the air grew colder, thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and the metallic tang of unspoken threats. Greco didn't look at her, his attention fixed on a tablet, his tattooed fingers flying across the screen with clinical precision. Don Denaro, however, watched her approach with the heavy, unblinking gaze of an old lion. Just as Rosa reached for the water carafe to fill the Don's glass, the gold-encased cell phone on the table vibrated with a violent, jarring hum. The sound was like a gunshot in the silent room. Denaro's hand, spotted with age but steady as stone, snatched the device. He pressed it to his ear, his brow furrowing into a roadmap of fury.
"Speak," he commanded, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. The voice on the other end was frantic, loud enough for Rosa to catch the panicked cadence that she couldn't make out the words. As the caller spoke, the color drained from the Don's face, leaving him looking like a ghost in his white suit. His grip on the phone tightened until his knuckles threatened to burst through the skin. Greco looked up, his predatory eyes narrowing, his hand instinctively moving toward the inner lining of his gray jacket. "Betrayal," the Don whispered, more to himself than the caller. He looked suddenly frail, the ivory statue of war beginning to crumble. He hung up the phone and stared at the white linen tablecloth, his breath coming in ragged hitches. In his shock, his mind seemed to retreat to the old world, to the safety of the ancient codes. He began to mutter a proverb in a thick, archaic Sicilian dialect, a dialect of mountain villages and blood oaths. "La chiave persa nel fango," Denaro rasped, his voice trembling. "The key is lost in the mud." It was a phrase of absolute despair, an admission that the foundation of his power had been severed and he was walking into a trap. Greco reached out to touch his father's arm, his expression one of feigned concern masking a hidden sharpness. "Father, we need to leave, now." But Rosa couldn't help herself. The phrase was like a spark hitting dry tinder in her mind. It was the first half of the Valente family's secret countersign, a code her father had taught her when she was 6 years old, telling her it was the only thing that could ever call for a truce between the lions and the wolves. The golden phrase wasn't just words, it was a royal signature of a bloodline thought to be extinct. Without thinking, ignoring the mask of the shy waitress, Rosa leaned in. Her voice didn't tremble. It rang out with a clarity that cut through the stagnant air of the bistro like a blade. "Ma l'oro brilla anche nell'oscurità più profonda," she finished. "But the gold shines even in the deepest darkness." The effect was instantaneous. Don Denaro froze, his eyes snapping up to meet hers with a look of pure, unadulterated shock. It was as if she had slapped him with a ghost. Greco's hand stopped midair, his entire body coiling like a spring, his eyes darting between the waitress and his father. The silence that followed wasn't just the absence of sound, it was a vacuum of history. For 10 seconds, no one breathed. The nobody in the black dress stood tall, her hand resting over her chest, not out of anxiety, but out of a reclaimed dignity. She had just spoken the one sentence that identified her as the last living heir of the vanished Moretti syndicate. She had broken the seal of her own protection, and as the Don's shock turned into a terrifying, piercing recognition, Rosa knew that the waitress had died, and the princess had been reborn in the light of the afternoon sun. The air in l'Oltremare didn't just grow still, it curdled. The silence following Rosa's whispered response was so absolute that the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer sounded like a series of hammer blows. Don Denaro's eyes, once clouded with confusion of age and crisis, sharpened into 2 points of lethal clarity. He didn't move, but the atmosphere around him shifted from shock to a cold, calculating hunger. "Who are you?" the Don breathed, his voice barely audible over the crashing surf outside. Before Rosa could answer, the reaction from the perimeter was instantaneous. The 3 bodyguards stationed at the entrance and the bar didn't need a verbal command. They were professionals, trained to recognize a breach in the reality they controlled. To them, a waitress speaking a forbidden royal countersign wasn't a miracle, it was a security failure. The sound was subtle at first, then unmistakable, the heavy metallic thrum of the bistro's front doors being bolted from the inside. Then came the click. It was the sound of safety switching off, the synchronized disengaging of safeties on 3 concealed firearms. The click echoed off the marble walls, signaling the end of the public world and the beginning of a private execution ground. Greco was the first to move. He didn't stand, he lunged, his hand snaking out to wrap around Rosa's wrist with the force of a steel trap. He pulled her closer, his face inches from hers. The scent of his expensive cologne was now underscored by the smell of gun oil. His eyes searched hers, not for a name, but for a threat level. "You have 5 seconds to tell me why a girl serving cheap house red knows the password of a dead house," he hissed. His thumb pressed hard against the scar on her wrist, a cruel, intuitive touch that made her gasp. Speak, or I'll let these men find the answer in your lungs." At the bar, the head of security, a man with a jagged scar across his nose, tapped his earpiece. "Lock it down. Nobody in, nobody out. Clear the terrace." The few remaining patrons, sensing the shift in the food chain, scrambled, but they were too late. The shutters over the ocean-facing windows began to hum, sliding down to seal the bistro in a tomb of mahogany and steel. The bright coastal sun was severed from the room, replaced by the amber, artificial glow of the chandeliers. Rosa looked from Greco's predatory face to the Don, who was still staring at her as if she were a ghost risen from the Sicilian soil. She felt the weight of the guns pointed at her back, the heat of the bodyguards closing the circle. The shy waitress was gone, stripped away by the sound of those safeties clicking off. "My name is Rosa Valente," she said, her voice steadying as the adrenaline finally burned through her fear. She looked directly at the Don, ignoring the man holding her wrist. "And if your men pull those triggers, you'll die tonight without ever knowing who truly betrayed you on that phone call." The Don's eyes flickered toward his son, then back to Rosa. He raised one single trembling hand, and the bodyguards paused, their fingers hovering over their triggers. The room remained a pressure cooker, the hiss of the espresso machine the only sound in the darkness. The bistro had become a fortress, and for Rosa, the hunt had officially begun. The grip on Rosa's wrist didn't loosen, but his focus shifted. The air inside the sealed bistro was thick with the ozone from the lowering metal shutters and the sharp metallic tang of the weapons now drawn in the dim amber light. He looked at his father, whose face remained a mask of haunted realization, and then at the perimeter guards. Greco's eyes, usually as cold and impenetrable as riverstone, flickered with a frantic, hidden calculation. He wasn't just a son anymore. He was a gambler realizing the deck had been swapped mid-game. The phone call had changed everything. The news of the betrayal, the lost key, meant the coup he had been quietly orchestrating with the mercenaries outside had been triggered prematurely. He had expected to be at the helm when the walls fell, not trapped inside a locked box with his father and a ghost from a dead dynasty. He could feel the eyes of the head of security, Marco, boring into his back. Marco was old school. He was loyal to the white suit, not the gray one. "Let her go, Greco," Denaro commanded, his old man leaning forward, his tattooed hands flat on the linen. "If she is who she says she is more valuable than any territory we own. She is the Valente blood. She is the only one who knows where the ledger is hidden." Greco felt a bead of sweat roll down his temple. This was the gamble. If he killed Rosa now, he would silence the one person who could expose his secret dealings with the mercenaries, but he would lose the Don's trust forever, and likely his life when Marco realized why he'd been so quick to pull the trigger. If he let her live, he had to play the role of the loyal protector, while the men he had hired began to batter down the very doors he had just locked. Outside, a heavy thud echoed against the mahogany entrance, then another. The mercenaries, Greco's mercenaries, were ahead of schedule. They weren't waiting for his signal. They were coming for the Don's head, and they didn't care if the sun was in the way. "They're here!" Marco shouted, his gun leveled at the reinforced glass of the foyer. "Don Denaro, we need to move. Greco, get him to the wine cellar." Greco looked at Rosa. For a fleeting second, his mask slipped. She saw the flash of sheer, naked panic in his eyes, the realization that he had unleashed a monster he could no longer control. He had spent months painting a masterpiece of betrayal, only for a shy waitress to splash the truth across the canvas in a single sentence. "Change of plans," Greco hissed, pulling Rosa toward the center of the room instead of pushing her away. He turned toward his father, his voice pitched in a perfect imitation of filial devotion. "Father, she's our only leverage. If the mercenaries get through those doors, they'll kill us both. But they won't kill a Valente, not if they want the Moretti millions." It was a lie, a desperate pivot to keep himself alive. He wasn't protecting Rosa. He was using her as a human shield against his own men. He drew his own weapon, a sleek, silenced pistol, but he didn't point it at Rosa. He pointed it at the door. "Marco, hold the line!" Greco roared, the authority in his voice masking the tremor in his hands. "Rosa, if you want to live to see tomorrow, you'd better start acting like the princess you claim to be, because my men, our enemies, don't care about waitresses." The first heavy breach of the mahogany doors sent a spray of splinters across the foyer.
"Follow me," Rosa commanded. She didn't head for the ornate exits or the grand staircase. Instead, she dived toward the service station, staying low to avoid the lead whistling through the air. They scrambled into the industrial kitchen, a world of gleaming stainless steel and hissing steam vents. To the Don and Greco, it was a maze of grease and heat. To Rosa, it was a map she had walked every night for 3 years. She knew which floorboards groaned, which pilot lights flickered, and exactly where the blind spots of the security cameras lay. "Through the walk-in," she hissed, sliding across a wet floor toward the massive steel door of the refrigerator. "We'll freeze to death in there," Greco spat, his pistol shaking as he glanced back at the kitchen swing doors, which were already being kicked open by men in tactical gear. "Shut up and move," Rosa snapped. She didn't open the main fridge. She reached behind a stack of heavy flour sacks to a narrow, rusted service panel used for the ancient plumbing of the building. With a strength born of pure adrenaline, she wrenched it open, revealing a dark, vertical crawl space. "This leads to the ventilation shaft of the bakery next door. It's too narrow for them to follow in groups, and it comes out in an alleyway they haven't scouted yet." As they squeezed into the cramped, soot-stained passage, the kitchen behind them erupted. The mercenaries were spraying the walk-in with lead, the sound of metal being shredded echoing like thunder. Rosa felt the Don's hand on her shoulder, a heavy, anchoring weight. She was leading the king of Sicily through the guts of a bistro, her apron stained with soot and grease, her shy demeanor replaced by the cold, calculating focus of a general. The crawl was agonizing. The heat from the ovens next door made the air thick and stifling, and the sound of Greco's frantic breathing behind them was a constant reminder of the serpent in their midst. But Rosa didn't falter. She guided them through the darkness, navigating by the feel of the pipes and the rhythm of the city's vibrations. When they finally tumbled out of a low-level vent into the damp, salt-crusted air of a side alley, the sounds of the massacre at L'Oltremare felt miles away. They were covered in ash, their high-priced suits ruined, standing in the rain. Rosa stood first, her back against the brick wall, her eyes scanning the mouth of the alley. She wasn't trembling anymore. She looked at the Don, then at Greco, who was staring at her with a new, dangerous kind of respect. "The bistro is gone," Rosa whispered, the rain washing the soot from her face to reveal the sharp, lethal lines of her heritage. "But the war has just started, and now you're on my turf." The rain was a cold, needle-sharp spray against the brick of the alleyway, washing the soot of the explosion from their faces, but doing nothing to dampen the heat of the tension between them. Don Denaro leaned heavily against a rusted dumpster, his white suit now a ruin of gray ash and bloodstains, looking every bit the aging lion whose pride had been savaged. Greco stood several paces away, his silenced pistol still gripped in a white-knuckled hand, his eyes darting toward the street corner as sirens began to wail in the distance. "You saved my life, child," the Don rasped, his voice a ghost of his former power. "But you are a Valente. My family spent 30 years trying to ensure your name was nothing more than a footnote in a funeral ledger. Why help me now?" Rosa stood in the center of the narrow passage, the wind whipping her damp hair across her face. She didn't look like a waitress anymore. She stood with a spine of iron, the ancient authority of her bloodline finally settling over her shoulders like a royal mantle. "I didn't save you out of mercy, Don Denaro," Rosa said, her voice cold and resonant. "I saved you because a common mercenary coup is a peasant's death, and my father's enemy deserves a more poetic end than a bullet in a kitchen. But mostly, I saved you because I need a pact." Greco stepped forward, a sneer twisting his features, despite the fear still shimmering in his eyes. "A pact? You're a waitress in a ruined alley. You have nothing to bargain with but a dead name."
Rosa turned her gaze to Greco, and for the first time, he flinched. The shy girl was gone. In her place was a woman who had seen the bottom of the abyss and refused to blink. I have the one thing your father has been hunting for since 1990, the Valente Vault. The lost key he was muttering about? It's not a proverb, it's a location, and it contains the ledger of shadows, the records of every bribe, every dirty politician, and every offshore account your family has used for 3 decades. The Don's breath hitched. The ledger was the only thing that could truly dismantle his empire or solidify it against the rising tide of traitors like the ones who had just bombed his restaurant. Where? The Don demanded, his eyes burning with a sudden, desperate hunger. Protection, Rosa countered, stepping closer to the old man. A blood pact. You swear on the soul of Sicily that the Valente name is restored to honor. You swear that the hunt for my head ends tonight, and that I sit at the table when the new world is built. In exchange, I will lead you to the vault. I will give you the power to crush the men who betrayed you. The Don looked at his son, back at the girl. He saw the fire in her, a fire that he recognized from his own youth. He reached into his pocket, drew a small silver stiletto, and nicked the palm of his hand. He held it out, the blood dark and thick in the dim alley light. On the soil of my ancestors, the Don declared, the feud is buried. You are no longer the ghost of the past, Rosa Valente. You are the architect of my future. Rosa didn't hesitate. She took the blade, marked her own palm, and pressed it against the Don's. The heat of the shared blood was a binding force, a bridge built over a canyon of corpses. Greco watched them, his face a mask of calculated fury. He realized that the lost key wasn't just a ledger, it was Rosa herself. By bringing her into the fold, his father hadn't just secured his empire, he'd introduced a rival for the throne. As the 3 of them moved toward the shadows of the street to disappear into the night, the pact was sealed. The waitress had vanished, and in the cold rain of a New York alley, a queen had just been bought with the promise of a kingdom. The safe house was not a palace, it was a cold industrial loft overlooking the gray expanse of the Hudson, but under the flickering fluorescent lights, it became a court. Don Denaro sat in a high-backed iron chair, his white suit blood-stained, a grim testament to the night's violence, while Greco paced the perimeter like a caged animal. At the center of the room stood the 3 mercenary captains Greco had hired, men who had expected to be collecting a bounty on a dead Don, but who now found themselves staring into the eyes of a woman they didn't recognize, yet instinctively feared. Rosa stood before them, the damp black dress of a waitress still clinging to her skin, but her posture was that of a sovereign. In her hand she held a small leather-bound ledger, the fabled Libro Rosso of the Valente family, recovered from the lost vault beneath the bistro's foundations. The mercenaries moved to draw their weapons, their faces hardened by greed, but Rosa didn't flinch. She simply opened the book. "You are here for the Denaro crown," Rosa began, her voice a calm, low resonance that commanded the silence of the room. "But crowns are made of gold, and gold is only as good as the bank that backs it. You think Greco is your ticket to a new empire? Greco is a man who builds on sand. I have the records of every payment he promised you, and more importantly, I have the records of the men he truly intends to pay to replace you once your work tonight is done."
The mercenary leader, a man with a throat of scarred leather, narrowed his eyes. "We have a contract with the sun. Why should we listen to a girl who smells of dishwater and smoke?" "Because the girl is the daughter of the man who built the city you're trying to steal," Rosa countered, stepping forward into the light. She didn't use a gun. She used the weight of history. She began to recite names, dates, and amounts, secrets that had been buried in the Sicilian hills and the Manhattan bedrock. "I know who your families are in the old country. I know which docks you use to move your product, and I know that the ledger in my hand contains the one thing Greco doesn't have, the keys to the Valente offshore reserves. You kill me, and the money stays locked in the dark forever. You kill the Don, and you become the most hunted men in the 5 boroughs without a cent to show for it."
Greco's face turned a sickly shade of ash. "She's bluffing! The ledger is empty! It's a trick!" Rosa turned slowly to Greco, her expression one of chilling pity. "The only trick here, Greco, was you believing you could lead lions when you were born a jackal." She looked back at the mercenaries, her gaze like a physical weight. "I am offering you a new contract, not as hired killers, but as the foundation of a restored house. Support the blood pact between the Denaro and the Valente, and you will be paid double. Betray us, and you will find that a Valente's memory is much longer than a Denaro's mercy." The silence that followed was the heaviest of the night. The mercenaries looked at Greco, then at the broken but still breathing Don, and finally at Rosa. They saw the authority in her eyes, the same lethal brilliance that had once defined the Moretti syndicate. They saw a woman who had outcalculated a prince while wearing a servant's uniform. The mercenary leader slowly lowered his rifle, the metal clattering against the concrete floor. One by one, the others followed. The coup hadn't been defeated by a bullet, but by a waitress who knew exactly when to stop playing the ghost. Rosa stood in the center of the room, the libro rosso clutched to her chest, the queen's gambit complete. She had won the room, she had saved the Don, and in the process, she had trapped the traitor's son in a web of his own making. The reopening of the bistro was not merely a business event, it was the coronation of a new dynasty. The scent of wood smoke and expensive lilies replaced the lingering ghost of gunpowder, and the shattered marble of l'Oltremare had been replaced with obsidian floors that reflected the light like a dark, still sea. Outside, the Atlantic crashed against the cliffs, but inside, the air was heavy with the respectful silence of men who had learned that power did not always roar. Sometimes it whispered in a dead dialect. Rosa stood in the center of the mezzanine, her reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows unrecognizable. The stained black apron and the tight, severe bun were gone. In their place was a gown of midnight silk that moved like liquid, and around her neck sat a collar of diamonds that caught the light with a lethal brilliance, the Valente heirlooms, recovered from the dark and returned to the sun. She no longer looked down at people's shoes. She watched the room with the predatory grace of a woman who knew exactly where the exits were and who held the keys to all of them. Don Denaro sat at his central table, his white chute pristine once more, though he moved with the careful slowness of a man who had seen the end and been brought back by a miracle. He watched Rosa with a pride that bordered on fear. Beside him stood Greco. The tattoos on Greco's wrists were now partially hidden by the heavy gold of a wedding band, a permanent shackle of loyalty. He was no longer the son who sought to burn the world down. He was the prince who had been tamed by the very ghost he tried to kill. The strategic union, the life-for-a-life pact, had turned a blood feud into a monopoly, and Greco had learned the hard way that Rosa's mind was a far more dangerous weapon than his mercenaries' rifles. As the elite of the city's underworld filed in, they didn't bow to the Don first. Their eyes drifted to the woman at his side. They saw the way Greco deferred to her, the way she handled the libro rosso as if it were a holy relic, and the way she moved through the crowd with the effortless authority of a queen who had survived the shadows. Rosa walked toward the table where the Don and Greco waited. She paused at the service station where she had once hidden, picking up a single crystal wine glass. She didn't fill it with water. She poured a deep, blood-red vintage, the kind that cost more than her old life was worth, and carried it to the center of the room. She raised the glass, and the room went instantly silent, a silence born not of terror, but of absolute recognition. "To the new era," she said, her voice steady and resonant, echoing through the cathedral of marble and glass, "where the past is honored and the future is earned." She caught Greco's gaze over the rim of her glass. There was no warmth there, only the cold, unbreakable respect of two predators who had agreed to share a territory. She had traded her invisibility for a crown, her anonymity for an empire. The shy waitress who had once trembled over a water pitcher was dead, buried beneath the ruins of the old world. In her place stood Sofia Valente Denaro, the woman who used the truth to win a war that guns could only prolong. As the guests began to applaud, Rosa felt the weight of the diamonds against her throat, a beautiful, heavy reminder that she was no longer a ghost. She was the Queen of New York, and she would never be invisible again.
Hey family, thank you for the constant love and support on this channel. Every like, share, comment, and subscription truly means everything to me and helps this community keep growing. If you're enjoying these stories, please like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Also, drop your name and where you're watching from in the comments. I'll be giving personal shoutouts and thanking you directly in my next post. I appreciate every single one of you.